IVAR.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here on a familiar screen full of smiling, engaged faces. I hope that remains the case for the next hour. I'm going to share my screen and get us going, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we're doing. 1 second while I do that. I'm just going to talk. Not do that. So I'm Ben Cairns from the Institute of Voluntary Action Research, and we are heavily involved and have been for about 15 years in research on unrestricted funding. And there we go. I'm now going to share. So what we're going to do today is, hang on. There we go. Dual controls. We're going to talk a little bit about the context for a discussion about restricted and unrestricted funding, which is the Open and Trusting Grant Making Initiative, which I'll outline in a minute, and then say a little bit about the charity experience of open and trusting and what's driving that whole push towards more progressive trusting funding. And then we're going to have three perspectives on unrestricted funding, and I will introduce our colleagues when I get to that point. I'm then going to say a little bit about the most recent research we published before we hopefully have around 20 minutes at the end for follow-up questions and debate and opinion and whatever you want to share. Very happy to follow up in conversation afterwards, and we'll post these slides and access to the three research reports that I'm going to reference. So, a little bit of background about open and trusting grant making, which we launched 2 years ago on the wave of the changes in practice that we saw from funders during COVID, a lightening of restrictions and a shift towards trusting charities to be well placed to know how and to spend their money and how to talk about what they spent their money on. And the essence of that movement is this notion that the time was ready and right for a simpler, more respectful and more inclusive philanthropy. And at the heart of the Open and Trusting Initiative are these 8 commitments. And to be a member of that community, funders have to sign up publicly to those 8 commitments and publish how they're trying to bring them to life, and periodically be held to account by their peers and by charities for how they are bringing those commitments to life. And I'm delighted that both Edmund and Hansa, who you'll be hearing from today, have been key parts of the charity membership of this movement over the last 2 years. And Amy and Pears Foundation are themselves founder members of the community. So these 8 commitments try and capture a set of practices and a set of behaviors that are trying to shift philanthropy and grant making towards greater mutuality and reciprocity. And we're particularly interested today in commitment 6, which is enable flexibility. And at the heart of the enable flexibility commitment is a commitment or intention to give unrestricted funding, and if funders can't, to make their funding as flexible as possible. And we're going to get into some of the debates about the case for and against restrictions and lack of restrictions over the course of the hour. Why does this matter? And it's important to note, IVAR is a research institute that operates at the interface between voluntary action and the world of funders and public policy. And our particular priority in the Open and Trusting Grant Making Initiative is to ensure that charity voice is at the heart of any call to action. And last autumn, we asked charities to tell us about what open and trusting grant making does feel like or could look like if funder practice was to shift. And there's this little word cloud of what we heard. Some powerful messages coming through there about feeling valued, about having the confidence, and about being empowered to do their work well and to be free from, I think, by implication, free from unnecessary or onerous burdens or restrictions. And when we asked charities to tell us what would make most difference, 10 actions were identified that would improve their funding experience. And again, of particular concern to us today are really action 6, give multi-year funding, and more specifically, action 8, give unrestricted funding. And over the last 2 years, we have seen some very good progress in relation to some of these actions in terms of greater transparency around application processes and some shift towards flexibility within grant. But we all recognize that there's a lot of progress to be made, particularly around flexible funding and around flexible reporting. So to summarize really what the Open and Trusting Grant Making Initiative is about, and it's important to note that it is about mutuality and reciprocity. This isn't just a one-way street. It is about making better use of everyone's precious time. And I think I should declare an interest as the director of IVAR that we see unrestricted funding, the lifting of restrictions, as one key way of making better use of everyone's precious time. And later on in our presentation, I'll talk a little bit about the research base for that. But I want to go on to our speakers. I'm going to start with Edmund, who's the Executive Director at Sport4Health KIC. Edmund has been a very active member of the Open and Trusting work since we started, and was involved in the first piece of research we carried out around unrestricted funding after the launch of the initiative, called the Holy Grail, and spoke at that launch. So I'm absolutely delighted that he's coming back and reprising that role and updating it with a presentation now on your experience, Edmund. So over to you.
Thank you, Ben. Good afternoon, everyone. I run a small organization. We've been operating since 2006, and our typical income has been stuck between 30,000 and 50,000 a year for probably the best part of 14 years, I would say, because we've been totally reliant on short-term project funding. Now, in our nearly 17 years of existence, I can probably count on one hand how many funders have offered multi-year grants and unrestricted funding to smaller groups. Yet small organizations often work with some of the most disadvantaged and marginalized communities, many of whom cannot or will not be able to access more mainstream provision. In terms of the short-term project funding, in common with hundreds of other smaller organizations, most funders have dictated that our size means that we're usually only able to apply for small grants, ranging from perhaps 1 day to a few months' work. So when applying for these amounts, quite a few funders often fund for direct project cost, which means that for a small organization like myself, that any extra costs involved, such as data collection, mid or final reporting, anything related to organization overheads are often unfunded. And as a result of that, we have to do this voluntary and unpaid. If I did feel that I wanted to include these costs within my bid, I feel that it would jeopardize my chances of being successful. So I usually leave them out, playing safe and focusing on the fact that I can get the funding for the project required. Now, that model is as prevalent now as it was 10 years ago, for the most part, I would say. Small organizations like myself, I'm hoping I'm speaking for many, are typically firefighting all the time to keep their work going. We get funded to do a project, jump in hoops to do it well, making it as successful as possible. Then we find that the funding project ends as the money has run out and it's hit the peak. We therefore have to find the time to keep looking for more funding, so we're able to sustain that project that we've spent all that time doing. And obviously there's no guarantees of us getting that funding. So that's all the hard work and effort that we've put initially doesn't go unwarranted. The initial grant, of course, does not include any costs associated with keeping the project going. Yet many of you ask the question, how do we sustain our project in the future? Small grants keep small organizations small. I feel they go against the sustainability, as they are for short-term projects only. They do not cover the true costs involved and do not support continuity of our services. This stop, start and start again process and system, which this type of funding imposes, is a huge negative for our service users. Also, overly restrictive funding restricts our ability to do the best job, to be flexible and as responsive as possible. Creating this ongoing uncertainty amongst service users, and for those of us who work in and run smaller groups, is really soul destroying and demoralizing. The negative psychological effects are so damaging, constantly throwing our ability to survive ourselves into question. However, on a positive note, only recently, within the last 3 or 4 years, I've been able to increase my turnover to closer to 100,000 per year. I ensure that in doing so, I have applied for as many projects and funders who recognize some form of full cost recovery, be it for administration or monitoring requirements. I have also applied for those who have offered core funding, unrestricted funding, and longer term funding, so multi-year funding. And more of you have done so as a result of the way that funding was reconsidered, I would say, during the pandemic in 2020. So thanks for all your help with that. In 2022, I generated more or less 100,000 income. It took 42 applications, for which my success rate was almost 60%, which I'm really proud of and grateful for. And I feel that more funders are really recognizing the struggles small charities are facing, and that most of them want to work with us and see that we really want to do well, rather than hang on to the old-fashioned model of holding the purse strings, asking us to jump hoops all the time, box ticking, etc. Perhaps smaller groups have traditionally been seen more risky. Let me give you an example of a well-known funder which states in their guidance that they wish to prioritize smaller local organizations, yet their income cap is over 2 million. I don't think that I would apply for that funder because of that. It's just so great. And then they go on to say that their grants cannot be used to support full cost recovery models. Now, so if you're intending to fund, for example, between £5,000 and £10,000, do you really think it's reasonable for a larger charity of, say, 2 million turnover and probably ample reserves to be applying and competing with the same pot of money as smaller organizations with a fraction of that turnover and little to no reserves? To summarize, what I'd really like to see, first and foremost, is that small grants should really be limited to small organizations with an income cap relevant to the sums offered. That way, we can see that you've made a distinction between smaller grassroots organizations such as mine and larger charities with paid staff devoted to fundraising, etc. I'm actually on the panel now for a grants panel for versus arthritis, and I see that smaller grassroots organizations cost much more efficiently and provide maximum impact of the grant to their intended participants. Unlike a lot of larger charities, I would say, who are not specific enough in their costings, and often the grant funding requested ends up being absorbed into their general costings across the board. So please give us a level playing field when it comes to competing for your funds. That would be so much appreciated. Show that you actually trust us. I mean, for example, do you ask for imposed on larger charities and compared to small organizations, copies of receipts to account for every single item supported by a grant? Why do smaller organizations always get treated inherently more risky than larger ones? Is it because the short-term grant funding puts us at risk as an organization, as we're unable to build up any reserves, and therefore we will struggle to sustain ourselves in the future? I feel that funders don't always reveal upfront exactly what their monitoring requirements will be. Example, for mid-reporting, final reporting, all the data collection which is required, which I understand that you need to show. But it would be great that you could really see it from our point of view, a smaller organization's point of view, where our resources are very limited and we obviously get unpaid to do all of this work. And it would be great if you could apportion some of the monies perhaps as a percentage of the project total project costs. And this would also help cost all that work that we are doing. Now, and finally, it's absolutely paramount, I feel, that funders should provide at least full cost recovery with any grant. That way, small grassroots organizations like mine are not having to always do the work for free, to use our meager reserves and also further jeopardize our existence and survival and become a financial risk, which in turn makes us undesirable to fund. Unrestricted funding is the best type of funding, of course, But I realize that not all of our funders can offer that due to your particular remit or criteria. But as a standard, please provide core funding or full cost recovery. Project funding alone only allows the project to happen, but it doesn't cover the true costs, and it makes small groups like myself unsustainable and at risk all the time. Thank you for allowing me to opportunity to speak today. And please do feel to sign up and be part of IVAR's Open and Trusting Grant Initiative, as this I feel will benefit us all. Thank you very much.
Edmund, thank you. And thanks for the message for our sponsor at the end there. But powerful stuff, and yes, highlighting the importance of proportionality and I think empathy and flexibility. And we can come on to debate whether funders really do have these restrictions to offer unrestricted, or whether they actually are a slight myth and mirage. We're going to go on to Hansa now. Hansa, thank you for joining us, founder of Holding Space and also a member of the team that worked to help hold open and trusting funders to account last autumn in a pioneering new process. And you're going to talk to us about your experience of Holding Space now, and great that you could join us.
Thank you, Ben. I think my internet is buffering, so can you actually hear me? That's okay. I think I keep freezing, so do let me know if it goes off. Thank you for this afternoon. Thank you for welcoming me here. Hi, everyone. So I'm Hansa, and I am CEO and founder of a charity based in East Sussex, Eastbourne, called Holding Space. We provide support. We provide parent peer support to families whose children are struggling with their mental health. And we offer a range of support sessions, from coffee mornings to one-to-one telephone support, through to low-cost counselling, and it's really offering that holistic approach for children, young people and families' mental health. We are now in our 4th year, so we are a very young charity, and I set up just before COVID, so you can imagine the challenges that were going on there for me as well in trying to get funding during COVID. I had a bit, I used to work for a charity. I used to work for a local food bank. So I did have some connections with local funders and a kind of relationship with them, which helped me to get started in those early days. And I think having had a previous relationship, having had that trust from them, kind of, gave me small amounts of funding. But trying to reach out to new funders, trying to get new funding has been really, really difficult. And as my colleague just previously said, Edmund, it's the short-term funding that's kind of always available. It's like every project, everybody wants project funding from you. So yeah, in the early days, it's taken us about 2 years to really get our foundation strong, to really know what our services are. So that project funding helped in the early days. But we've got strong foundations now. We know which services work. And what we want to do is build upon those services. We don't want to be thinking about new projects all the time, because that in itself is really tiring as well. Just like, oh my God, there's a funding bit here. I know I'm eligible for it, but I have to try and put a new project in. We're a volunteer-led organisation. So I've basically worked project to project for the last 3 years, and we've been lucky that my trustees have been able to put me onto a wage this year. So again, it's been small amounts of money, and that in itself, I'm a single parent, so that in itself has been really, really difficult as well, knowing how I was going to survive personally, as well as trying to grow the charity. But I think the message that we're both saying is, we don't need to be doing project funding all the time. Look at what we do. Trust us as founders and as CEOs of our charities, that we know what's best. We've listened to our client group. We now need to grow that charity. I've had 900 families through my door in 3 years. So, we've proven the success really. And it is that core funding. Since COVID, I'm still really, really struggling to find long-term core funding. Like any business, like any charity, I cannot run it on just volunteers. And that's not, demising the role of volunteers is so, so important, but you can't run a business just on volunteers, and charities are businesses at the end of the day. So we now need to be considered for long-term funding to give us that stability to grow. I find with some funders, because you haven't got a relationship with them, or that they fund the bigger charities, you see when it comes out, they're always funding the bigger charities. They've got that relationship with them. But every charity starts somewhere, and give us small charities a chance, is what I'm saying. Those big charities were once where we were. And I think, and again, you know, it's my personal opinion, when you give the money to smaller charities, you're actually seeing where it's going. It is going into the heart of the people that we support. Yes, we all have overheads. I know as charities grow, you're going to have massive overheads, but the smaller charities are making a big, big difference. It is really going to the heart of them. And we just now need the staff as well as the volunteers to be able to do what we do and help us to take that next step. Help us to build a relationship with you. Yes, reporting with some funders, I get there have to be outcomes, I get there has to be reporting, but with some funders, for the amount we're asking for, the reporting takes longer, you know, and it's when you're a small one-man band in a way, it's a lot of pressure to be able to do all of that. Let us pick the phone up to you, I think. You know, some funders are fantastic, and as you grow, you get that relationship with them. Some you just can't get through the front door. And I know you've all got pressures. This is not as black and white, as linear as we'd like it to be. You've all got pressures. You must get thousands of phone calls or emails, but it's finding that balance. There's got to be a better balance out there with some funders, I think, in able to just have that chat, in able to just know, you know, what you're looking for. Instead of trying to find the right buzzwords on an application form, because that, you know, that's what it is sometimes, isn't it? You write the right thing and you strike lucky. So I suppose my message is, yes, we're a young charity, but we've proven that we're successful. We need a chance to grow. We need that long-term funding. We need you to open your doors really to our long-term funding and give us stability. You know, everyone's got a cost of living crisis out there. Most of us that have founded charities have done it because we've got a passion for it. There's a reason behind it, but we're still human. We've still got to live, and we're all struggling with cost of living. So give us just a little bit of a break, I think, and breathing space. Give us breathing space as CEOs to grow our charities to the next level that they're going, because we're not slowing down, you know, and especially children and young people's mental health is not slowing down. It's a crisis out there. So certainly for my charity, it's, you know, I would hope I didn't have to exist, but I do. And I hope, you know, I don't know if you're into questions, but that gives you some background as to how we feel as CEOs. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Hansa, very much. Really appreciate that. And some powerful messages again there about the kind of the trap of being stuck in projects, but also about trust, and shifting to more of a dialogue and more of a shared approach to thinking about how best to fund good work and how to think about stability and growth. We're going to move on now to hear from Amy. Pears Foundation joined Open Trusting at its launch and have been champions in different ways, and we're really pleased that you've taken the time out, Amy, to share some reflections today. So over to you.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Hansa and Edmund. And my first thought listening to you both, my highly articulate thought was, how is it that in 2023 we are still talking about not just funding direct costs and overheads? I can't understand it. I've been at Pears 16 years. This was one of the first things I was told about when I came into the sector. How have we not got there yet? Sorry. So Pears Foundation is, we're a family foundation with a living donor at our heart as our executive chair and an active philanthropic family. We are a broad funder. We fund in a number of different areas, and we have kind of themes and clusters of grants. And we have a relational approach. So we do our funding face-to-face, we build relationships, and we don't take applications, so we can put the time into building those relationships. So that's what you need to know about us before I start. And I'm just going to give a quick overview of our approach and some of the questions that we get asked around it. So we have 4 internal categories of funding: core funding, project, and capital. And the reason I say 4 is we have an internal split that we split core funding into restricted and unrestricted. So unrestricted is obvious. And then we have a little internal category called core restricted, where it's a relatively loose restriction and it's going towards core costs and overheads. So it could be a core staff post, it could be a loose restriction to a particular part of the service they're providing. Just it often works in the bigger organizations just to give us a bit of a tie-in, or to give a loose sense of where the funding is going, but we don't expect it to be accounted for as a project. We don't expect sort of ring-fence accounting. We expect it to be reported on as if it were an unrestricted grant. So we still want to know about the organisation as a whole, and they have very little restriction on how to spend those grants. Last year, our funding was just over 20 million, and I think 9 million of that was core restricted or core unrestricted, so about half our funding last year. Another reason for that core restricted is we do things like we'll fund an academic centre within a university, so we can't give that money as unrestricted to the university, but the centre that we're funding, it's an unrestricted grant to them, so we have to have these categories to kind of take account of the quirks of our funding. But overall, our mission isn't to give grants. It's to use the resources of the Pears family to do good in the world and to help the causes that they care about. And if what we're really looking to do is further those causes, then we're looking to fund good people and good organisations and help them do what they do better. And the best way to do that is often unrestricted. So when we're talking to a new organisation, unless it's specifically about a capital donation or they've asked us to help with a project, then our default is always, well, we're talking about unrestricted, aren't we? And our assumption is that, we'll engage, we'll get to know them, and unless our priorities change or something major changes on their part, we'll stick with them. So our figures at the moment are 69% of our grantees we funded consistently for 5 years or more, and 35% for 10 years or more. Now, that will be renewed in tranches of 1, 2, and 3 years, but we have that long-term approach. And what sits behind it is trust. We're finding good organisations and we're trusting them. And if we're not sure, then we'll meet the CEO, we'll meet as many people as we need to meet in that organisation, and we'll take the time to really understand their vision, their strategy, their work plan, until we can feel that that trust is there. And our due diligence process is much less about the formal due diligence, which we do, it's important, and much more about building knowledge, understanding, and trust. But we start from the assumption that the people that we are talking to are in it for the right reasons and doing work they believe in. They're not trying to scam us out of our grant money that we have to protect. My job isn't to stop the Pears family giving any money out, it's to make it go out and to get it out there doing good. So that's the sort of how our approach works, and the benefits for our partners are obvious. Those are, trust is vital for them to really get the most out of an unrestricted grant, and they have to trust us as well. So one of our rules at Pears is we don't penalise honesty. If you're funding an organisation for the long term, then you can't, if you want to really see the full picture, you can't expect that picture to be rosy all the time, either externally or internally. So 2 good examples are, we've been funding the Trussell Trust since 2007. They run the largest networks of food banks in the UK. In the time that we've been funding them, the need has skyrocketed. Food poverty is worse than ever. It's not because the Trussell Trust is crap. So you can't, we're expecting to see things change, over the long term. Sometimes they change for the better, sometimes for the worse, and our organisations are in the mix. And we also have organisations, we funded a Holocaust centre we funded for nearly 20 years. And in that time, it's nearly gone insolvent twice. It's had all sorts of issues. We've stuck with it and we've helped and we've seen it go up and down, and it's in a really good place now. And actually, it's really satisfying to see how with the right support, an organisation can turn itself around. And that if we were all to sort of run away when they were at the bottom, they would never be able to turn that round again. And the other rule that we have is we don't penalise honesty. If you want to build that trust and give unrestricted, and you want to see the full picture, then you can't run screaming for the hills when you're told it. And we feel it's really important that if an organisation turns around to us and says, we need help or there's trouble, we'll listen. We may not be able to help. We will be thinking, is there failing or fault at your end that needs to be addressed? But our assumption won't be, oh, well, then we'll stop funding you. And we find it's a virtuous circle. Unrestricted funding is our opening commitment. It's our way to get to know an organisation and its leaders, and it builds further knowledge and trust, which leads to further funding and even other grants. It keeps our eyes at field, at cause level, rather than individual organisations. What I would say, though, is there is a time and place for restrictions. I've mentioned a couple of them, but another one we found is for kind of R&D type projects or to pilot or roll out something new. If those aren't protected, it can be really hard for CEOs to balance the needs of the present with the needs of the future. If you've got money coming in and it's not restricted for that, you've got to spend it on the electricity bill, you've got to do what's needed now. And sometimes they're the ones that ask us for, actually what we want from you as a project. And the key there is flexibility. It has to come from them. All the times I can think of in the last few years where, particularly during COVID, we've said to a grantee, do you want us to unrestrict that project? They've said, no, we really want to do it and we need your funding for it. Another good example is when we first started funding the Scouts Association pre-COVID, their core funding was relatively healthy, and what they wanted from us was a grant to try something new, to look at how you could recruit volunteers in hard to reach areas. So as long as it comes from them, it's not us imposing, full cost recovery is built in, that there is a time and a place for restricted. I think for us, it's a question of mindset. It's about taking that wide view, not counting every bean, and whether it's core or project funding, being flexible and thinking about what the organisation wants and needs rather than our own needs. One of the questions Ben asked me to address is that question of, is it too risky? And my answer to that is simply, why is it any more risky than restricted? You know where your money's gone in restricted funding, but you actually know less about the organisation overall. We had years ago, one of my first grants at Pears Foundation, we were funding a project, the organisation had asked for it, and it all went down the drain because the organisation became insolvent during the course of the project. You couldn't have told that from their last annual accounts because they were just about all right, and a lot can happen in 12 months. And when we said, why didn't you tell us? If you told us that there was a giant hole in your core, we would have addressed that, and then we could have done the project down the line. So just because you're funding a project, it doesn't mean that you know any more about the organisation. And for us, it's about knowing them. Our duty risks, and you can control for them in other ways, but either way you're funding the same organisation, and as I say, if you want to see the whole picture, then you have to accept that it won't always be rosy. The other question we get is, well, how do you measure impact? And I think there's two words for me here. One is proportion. If you're giving for a small project, then yes, of course you can measure for it and account for it, but it's only one part of the organisation, which is itself part of a wider ecosystem of organisations. And possibly that speaks to our need as funders rather than their need as organisations in the field. And also a sense of humility, even when we're giving large amounts. We could give 10 million a year to child and adolescent mental health. That's nothing. This is a multi-billion-pound long-term systemic problem. And we have a sense of humility that how would we measure our impact? But we're always just part of the mix, part of the story. But it's our partners moving the dial, and by giving them unrestricted funding, we're helping them to play their part. And the other issue, the question we get is sustainability. And again, for us organisations, they're always good. Most organisations will always need funders, whether it's us or someone else. We do have an eye to dependency. We look at the proportion of overall turnover that we're funding, but equally there are some organisations that we help set up. We think they should exist, and we'll have to bear the risk of that and be more than what would be considered a healthy part of their turnover. But we're just very aware of that. It's done in a relationship way. The only question I sort of have around unrestricted is more of a how than a what. It's obvious that we should do it, but we do struggle sometimes with how do you set the amount. We look at proportion of turnover, But I think it's still sometimes more about us than them, and we're looking at ways that we can encourage organisations to sort of, especially as we don't have an application process. So I spoke to one organisation where, you know, the amount we would normally give an organisation of that size was about 30,000. And when I said out of interest, you know, if we were to give you 30, would that be useful? They came back and said, well, it would be amazing, but if you were to give us 50, we could employ a new member of staff. So that's what we did. Still unrestricted. I don't expect them to come back and tell me they've employed a member of staff, but we had that dialogue and that flexibility. And Ben asked me to just address what needs to change in the sector. And I would say it's about not waiting for trust, but to use unrestricted funding to build trust. It's a tool for building trust rather than something that has to be earned when an organisation has built your trust. And our kind of motto at Pears is commit, learn, refine. It starts with the commitment. That's our entry into the relationship. Fine, we'll give you an unrestricted grant and we'll see what happens. But it's a tool for building trust rather than a kind of prize to be earned.
Thank you, Amy. And nicely picking up on some of what we heard from Edmund and Hansa about making that transition, about being trusted to do the work well, and this notion of helping organizations to do the work better seems important. And increasingly, I think within the open and trusting movement, we've been trying to encourage funders to think about what will it take for this work to go well, as that there's being a very important and legitimate question about the form of funding. And what we're hearing very much from all three of you in different ways is that short-term, narrowly defined project funding is unlikely ultimately to help the totality of an organization's work go well. I'm going to round us off with a whistle-stop tour through about 15 years of research, but particularly research we've carried out in the last 2 years. I'm going to share my screen briefly. I'm going to skip over most of the slides. They will be posted, and the research reports, the 3 research reports I'm referring to, are available free to download on our website. So let's go. So these 3 publications, the Holy Grail of Funding, November 21, in the voices of trustees and senior staff of foundations about how they have managed to embrace unrestricted funding and particularly address some of these traditional obstacles around perceptions of risk and perception of difficulty around impact. And I think we've heard some helpful things from our speakers about that. We then carried out an evidence review on, okay, given that restricted funding is the dominant model of funding still in the sector, what actually does the evidence tell us nationally and internationally? I'll come back to that in a second. And then we brought that together earlier this month with a piece called Making the Case for Unrestricted Funding. And quick 2 definitions very quickly. Restricted funding, funds that can only be used for the purpose specified by the donor. The donor knows best, or certainly tells you what to do with it. Unrestricted funding, funds that you can apply at the discretion of the trustees in line with your charitable purposes and mission. Clearly, there's a lot of issues around language, around core coming in there as coterminous with unrestricted, but those are the 2 big distinctions, are who has the discretion there. Really, with restricted, the discretion rests with the funder, and in unrestricted, the discretion rests with the funded organization. What is the rationale for restricted funding? This is what the evidence review tells us about the rationales that are given by people who use restricted funding. And it's firstly that, as it were, that funders know best, or more generously, that funders feel that they can guarantee a closer alignment between their interests and the work that they're trying to fund. This notion that it strengthens accountability, because in theory there is a more direct line between the funded work and the grant, and therefore it's easier to see and track. And there's a point about lawful compliance. I would say about lawful compliance that there's a real danger, I think, of fetishizing that. We are all face lawful compliance with our objects. And accepting that, you know, you may have a restriction around a geographical area, that does not necessarily mean that you therefore have to jump straight to restrictions on all of that grant. So you can, and Nick Addington from William Grant Foundation has a very good blog on our website about this, about managing, you know, about more flexible restrictions where they're appropriate. And I just want to add that you know, we would agree with Amy's point about unrestricted being the default. IVAR's position and the position of the research is certainly not that there is no case for restrictions. There are absolutely cases for restrictions, but the evidence review tells us that the position of restricted funding as the dominant model is just not backed up by the evidence. The rationales for unrestricted from the evidence are listed here. I'm going to skip through there because I just want to get on to 2 or 3 things, and all of that is available on the website and in the evidence review, which is a serious and comprehensive account of what is out there. But the key findings I want to just pick up 2. Firstly, that the evidence for the assumed benefits of restricted funding, so the evidence that we have about those benefits, offer an inadequate justification for the strong preference still shown by many. In other words, the evidence for doing this and for it being beneficial just does not exist sufficiently. The evidence about unrestricted funding shows real promise that a range of benefits can be delivered that are important to funded organizations and funders alike, because healthy, well-functioning organizations feeling empowered and confident to do their work well are more likely to deliver work that is benefit to the communities and causes that matter to charities and that matter to the funders that are supporting charities. So there is a shared interest in this question: what will it take for the work to go well? And that's why that powerful message from funded organizations about open and trusting grant making, giving people confidence, making people feel valued, those things really matter in terms of the work going well, or enabling, as Amy said, the work, people to do the work better. And then finally, I'm going to stick through here, because this is what we can summarize as the arguments for unrestricted funding. Firstly, we see evidence around improved performance and delivery against objectives. We pick up points from Edmund and Hansa. All of that time spent applying for and then servicing short-term project grants. If you were to transfer that time just to doing the work with the backing of a core funding grant, that's what we're likely to see. It enables you to invest in organizations' infrastructure. It enables organizations to manage fluctuations in income and changes in circumstances. There's greater freedom to use staff and volunteers efficiently. And it allows you to focus on more meaningful data collection and reporting rather than just having to service multiple individual project grants. So actually the case for unrestricted, it's not just anecdotal, it's not just instinctive. The evidence review suggests that there is a growing body of data that supports the benefits of unrestricted and that counters some of the traditional concerns which you might pick up in the discussion that Amy referred to around perception of risk, anxiety about impact, and anxiety about accountability. So I am going to stop sharing. Apologies, that was very quick, but I want to give us 15 minutes or so for questions. All of that material is online, and I'm very happy to answer questions offline if people want to continue the conversation. But for now, I want to open the floor. I'm guessing I'll see someone if they put their hand up. Melaine, or you will, or you post something in the chat. And Edmund, Hansa, and Amy, if you want to come back on anything I've raised, then please do. To give you time to ruminate.
While we wait for people to put questions in the chat or raise their hand, I have a question for Edmund and Hansa, if that's all right.
Go for it. And actually, there's a very good question that we've also got from Tim at SIB. So, but let's start with you.
Okay, perfect. Just been a lot of talk about trust, and Amy, you mentioned also kind of that work that you're doing with organizations to build trust, but it would be useful to hear from Edmund and Hansa just how kind of difficult or easy you're finding it to have that honesty with funders, especially the ones you're applying to funding for or you're already being funded by, and having those honest conversations when funding is so competitive and when it's often short term, and the other problems you've identified.
Thanks, Marlene. Who wants to get that? Hansa, go for it.
With some funders, we've got a fantastic relationship, and I can pick up the phone and have that conversation with them, and understand their point of view as well. So I think it's a bit of both. I think over the years we've had kind of ongoing funding come through. We've built up that relationship with our funders to enable us to have conversations with others. It could just be one-off funding. You try the relationship, it could just be a one-off, and that's it. So in that respect, I wouldn't be able to pick up the phone or feel that I could talk to them. But it takes time to build that relationship up as well, I think.
Thanks.
Some are more open to it than others.
Edmund, do you want to come in on that?
From my perspective, to be honest, I feel that when you're dealing with small funders or people who are offering small grants or short-term funding, I get a feeling that they're looking for a wide range of projects to be able to fund. As a result of that, I feel that they feel that you should be honored that you've actually got the funding, even though it's just a small amount. And also that you feel that you have to jump the hoops and tick box and do all the box ticking and all the requirements which go with the funding. So I feel that from that perspective, I don't think those funders are particularly open to any sort of dialogue or or a different process perhaps, because they are looking to fund a lot of people. And as a result of that, I understand that their processes will obviously follow that in some format from their point of view. So therefore, everybody will have to follow the same process with that small bit of funding.
Edmund, do you want to say anything about Tim's question around reporting? I don't know if you can see it in the chat, which is around the extent to which there is variety in a process, but also clarity around purpose and use.
So when it comes to reporting, again, I feel that some funders obviously have the ability in-house to be able to have more say in terms of their reporting requirements. But quite a few funders I've experienced are actually using external people, so are outsourcing the managing of their grant or their fund. Now, if you're doing that, what they're doing is that you're actually paying someone else to manage your grant, aren't you? So because you're not able to perhaps do it in-house due to restrictions or people power, whatever. So if you are paying someone to do that, those people who are managing on your grant on your behalf will be doing the best job they can. Now, are these people going to know exactly who you're funding and what your funding criteria entails? Or are they going to make sure that they do the best job they can, i.e. many, many questions of reporting questions, which I've come across, which are even longer than the application itself, mind you, because they feel that they have to do a good job. So I have to throw in the mix. Do you actually need to, how should we say, outsource the managing of your grant or your fund to an external person? And also the consequences of that on small organizations like myself.
Thanks, Edmund. I mean, it's a really good question. I don't want to get too sidetracked into a discussion on reporting, but I could say a couple of things, Tim. One is that in the first round of the accountability process for open and trusting at the end of last year, this was the commitment where progress is proving hardest to achieve. And we will be doing a bit of benchmarking around current practice within the open trusting community this year, going back to some earlier work we did pre-COVID around principles of good reporting. The first one of which is to, when you award a grant, be very clear about the information that you're going to collect and why, and the use you're going to put it to, and have transparency around that, but also think about context and if and how your grantees can repurpose or recycle reports that they are already committed to, rather than and shifting away from bespoke reporting. Because I think there is a trend that Edmund hints at, that reporting is used as a sort of second stage of due diligence, even though you've actually already completed that in order to get the grant in the first place. So I think there's a real challenge in the system at the reporting end, undoubtedly. And I would say, and Amy, you might want to come in on this around unrestricted funding. One of the traditional obstacles to awarding unrestricted funding, I think, at whether it's at officer level or trustee level, is an anxiety around, you know, what you're going to be able to find out about what the money was spent on. I have to say, and this is perhaps a little off message here, but I think a lot of these obstacles are proxies for wanting to retain control, A, thinking you know best, B, and something to do with the difficulty in trust, as if, as Amy said, somehow that if you don't put restrictions in, you're going to see widespread fraud or people escaping with the money. I mean, I'd love to see what the data is on fraud, but I suspect it doesn't warrant the amount of restricted funding there is in the system. Amy, did you want to say anything? I wonder around the kind of the reporting trust access.
I would agree with that. I think one of the problems is the Charity Commission, and that we have a fear that, you know, if we can't account for it, are they going to come after us? Certainly, we ended up having to ask for a lot of data on safeguarding that we weren't sure we actually needed, but our lawyers told us we had to, because a few years ago the Charity Commission started to come down really heavily in the wake of the Oxfam Save the Children scandals on safeguarding. So I think sometimes we're asking for stuff because we feel like that is the way that our trustees can show that they are, you know, doing their job as trustees, but we have to think really carefully about not creating too much of a burden for the charities. And I think, you know, your thing about finding out what money was spent on, I think that's the thing. We just don't ask. We assume it was spent on, you know, it's all in the annual accounts. We know what the charity spent money on, and it's more kind of, how did it meet its own objectives during that year? What did you do? And also we tend to use reporting as the replacement for a renewal application. So when we've been through the reporting process, we'll renew off the back of that. We won't ask for a second set of, you know, we'll include in our reporting what's next for you. And we use that as renewal, so there isn't a second process for renewals.
Can I just jump in and just say, I'd like to mention that when we are required to fill out all of this extra monitoring on top of obviously our projects, etc., it'd be really, really nice to actually hear back from you to say, we read your monitoring report, and we really understand how the money is spent. You know, just a little bit of feedback to show that you've actually taken the time to read, rather than, you know, thousands of, or quite a heavy report of questioning, and then I send it through and I hear nothing back. This is what I mean by the box ticking, isn't it? It's like, are your reporting or your questions that necessary? Are you using the information that I've given you to greater use, you know, as a data collection tool for evaluation purposes? If so, at least in a way have a courtesy to read what we have spent time doing. I mean, I think I say that from all charities, smaller charities, when it comes to it, because we all have the same finding the time to do these reporting requirements, isn't it? And it'd be so nice to hear back to say, well, you know, we understand that the project went really well, or something, isn't it? At least, rather than just hearing nothing. And that's why I feel that with the short-term funding projects, it is the funders have the power, purse strings, they have the power. So therefore they dictate how the grant is spent. They dictate what monitoring is required. And therefore you don't, and that for me isn't a two-way conversation like Amy is trying to do with her fundees.
Thanks, Edmund. Yes. Thank you. Hansa, sorry, you're going to come in.
No, that's fine. Tim, I was just going to answer the second part of your question, to be honest. And in that, yes, we do the reporting, but I don't know what happens with that data. So, and that's in all honesty, what does the funder then do with the data? We never get that feedback, or what, I know why they need it. We get that you have to show outcomes and that your money's been spent in the right way. But what happens to that data? I haven't got a clue. And actually, it would be nice to know why we are doing it, I suppose.
Yes, it's interesting how often these conversations come back to simple human qualities of respect and courtesy. And also, I think that if funded organizations behaved in some of these ways, they would probably struggle, or it would be frowned upon by their funders. So, I think we're making progress, but we have a long way to go to have a greater balance of expectations and behaviors here. And whilst I think it's not always necessary to frame this as being about power, clearly there is something about an more appropriately balanced relationship here. I wonder if we've got a lot of funders here who are either feeling completely comfortable about their balance being restricted and unrestricted, or are converting as we speak. I'm just seeing we've got something from Waits here. Interesting. Yes, and Melaine, that I think let's finish off with that, because I want everyone to be able to go away at 3 and do what you need to do. But there is a nice companion session to this one where Lloyds, who've obviously fully they've drunk the unrestricted Kool-Aid and digested it, and are now have moved to completely unrestricted and long-term to multi-year, are going to talk about the monitoring and evaluation, and particularly how they conceive of organizational well-being and resilience as a proxy for impact. So actually are trusting that if an organization is able to present and talk and with greater confidence and has freed up time to do the work well, that we can infer from that reasonably that organization is going to be better placed to do its work well. And so that's a reminder, I think, as we go into the hour, that this is not an exact science. And so when we think about trust, we've got to think imaginatively about what it means to bring trust to life in that, through that relationship, and what are the cues and what are the signals we might look for from each other that we can be trusted but also be trustworthy. And I think that's a burden that we need to both take on in that relationship, and not expect that it all falls to charities to prove themselves to be trustworthy. Funders need to take some of that on themselves if we're really going to move towards something that can genuinely be described as open and trusting. So can I thank Edmund and Hansa particularly for sharing their stories, putting your head above the parapet, and we really appreciate that. It's really important that we keep the drumbeat of the charity experience at the heart of this movement for change, because that's why we're trying to do it. Amy, thank you also, as always, for talking about Pears and hopefully inspiring others to take a bit more risk and be a bit more human. And thank you everyone for joining. Please read the research, sign up to IVAR's newsletter, sign up to Open and Trusting, talk to us about what that means. If you're not a member of London Funders and you're eligible, join them, because they're doing great work in this space and really leading the movement for change. So thank you everyone, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you all. Thank you.